All right. We're about to tie a bow on class design, at least for now. There's a ton to know about class design, but we're going to save the advanced stuff for kind of the end of the year. So, the next thing I want to talk about is static variables. Now, kind of the new thing when we were doing classes was these instance variables. These variables belong to an instance of the class, okay? In other words, an object. So, in other words, radius doesn't really make sense unless we're talking about a very specific circle. So, this circle right here has this radius, this circle right here has this other radius, okay? And it makes sense for the radius to be different each time. Now, static variables, instead of belonging to an instance of the class, it belongs to the entire class. It doesn't belong to a specific object. It's not something like radius. Okay, so the first one I'll talk about here in the circle class is circle count. This variable just says how many circles have been created. So what I've done, the first thing I want you to notice is not only did I declare the variable, but I also initialized it. That's because the constructor's job is not to initialize your class variables. You don't your static variables, your class variables. You don't need a constructor to give it an initial value. We need to do that on the front end here. Okay. Now that said, in my constructor, every time I construct a circle, I'm doing circle count plus plus to say, hey, my circle count has increased. Now, theoretically, we can do a getter for this and a setter. But if you do, you have to make sure that your method that interacts with this variable is also static. Because it shouldn't depend on the circle itself, whether or not there's a certain count of circles. Okay, so that's one example of a static variable, a class variable. So again, this is something that belongs to the whole class, not just an object. Another thing I really like to do with static variables is assign default parameters, so that when I construct something, I can just say, all the things that I construct, okay, are just going to be these default values. And I can change the default values to something else later, but I'm going to go ahead and initialize this variable called default radius. I'm going to set it equal to 1, and this belongs to the class. So that default radius doesn't belong to any object. It's just a part of my class. And then in my my second constructor here, I make a new circle. I call the other constructor, but I give it a radius of default radius. And so if I make a new circle, it's going to be a circle with that default radius. Now, if I change the default radius, then the next time I call it, it's going to have this new value. But the important thing you need to realize is, again, this default radius value belongs to the class, not an individual object. It's something that floats around independent of these objects right here. So that's static variables. You can also have static methods. Static methods, though, are basically what we've been doing the whole rest of the year. It's just a method that doesn't act on an object. And you can certainly have those in your classes. Okay, if you have something that's not acting on a particular object, then that makes complete sense to do. The other thing I want to show you about with static variables is class constants. Okay, so class constants are what they sound like. They're something that should be held constant that shouldn't actually vary. It's weird to call it a variable if you don't want them to change it. Um, so, for example, I could make a public static final double called full rotation degrees and set it to 360. Okay. Now, it's public because they can access it. You'll notice your class constants you make public because it doesn't matter if they can access them or not because it's final. That means you cannot change the value. You can take on, you can use that value, you can get it, but you cannot set it to anything else. So public, static because it belongs to the class, final because we can't change it, double because it's a double, and its name is full rotation degrees. Now, just like if you remember before, we had math.pi, and pi was all uppercase. Constants, usually we make all uppercase to show that they're constants. So anytime I call circle dot full rotation degrees, it will give me this 360. Now, I would never use this in particular for a constant because it's just really easy to type 360. But in some cases, it's not an easy value to get. It's not a number that's easily accessible or commonly known, and so we give it a name so our users can access it easily. Now, this default constant, or sorry, this class constant can also be of another type, like in this case, circle. So unit circle, I'm going to say, is a new circle of radius 1. Now, again, I probably wouldn't actually do this in the circle class, but for example, in the color class, um, if I want if I want to make the color gray, it's not actually very easy to make the color gray. You have to figure out how much red, how much blue, how much green, and then put that all in the constructor. Whereas you may just want to make a color, call it gray, and then your users can use gray as their object whenever they need that particular color. But in this case, whenever I make a new circle, I can, instead of calling the constructor, I can access this circle constant that I made, this unit circle. Okay, and here I'm accessing my 360 degree constant. Okay, circle dot full rotation degrees. And again, I'm able to call on these because they are public. Now, what I do want to show you, again, with the final thing here, if I try to say circle dot full I'm just going to copy it, full rotation degrees, then what happens if I try to change it to 15 degrees? Then I get this error that says cannot assign a value to final. It's final, so I can't change it. So again, you can make static final variables that are constants just to make stuff easier for the user to access a particular value or to create a particular object. These aren't necessary for the class to run, but they can just make things a lot smoother when there's complicated things that you need access to over and over and over. All right, thanks, guys.